The night Jess Calder rode back up our road, the lamp in the kitchen window was already lit, the same as it had been every dark of every evening for 12 years, and I was the only soul at Halloran's Crossing who knew exactly whose hand kept setting it there. I had been hauling a split singletree out to the barn, my knees telling me I was too old for the work and my hands not listening, when I heard a horse coming up off the flat slow and tired in the last gray light. I stopped where I stood. I had heard 10,000 horses come up that road in my years at the Ashby station, freight teams and stage relays and drovers and strangers, and I could tell you a man's business by the way his animal walked the last quarter mile. This one walked like it had walked a long way and meant to stop, and there was something in the set of the rider, the way his shoulders carried, that put a cold finger straight down my spine before my old eyes could even name him. I set the singletree down in the dust, and I stood and I waited. He came on out of the dusk, and the lamp from the window threw a little yellow square across the yard, and he rode his horse right up into it and stopped, and looked down at me, and I looked up at him, and neither of us said a word for the time it takes a man to know he is not dreaming. "Tobe," he said finally, just that. His voice was deeper than I remembered and worn down at the edges like a stair tread, but it was his. "Jess," I said. That is how it began again, the thing I am going to tell you about. Though to tell it right I have to go back a good deal further than that night. Back to before the trouble. Back to when Jess Calder was a long-legged boy of 19 who could gentle a spoiled horse the way another man might talk down a frightened child. And Della Ashby was the prettiest and the most stubborn girl in 3 counties, and I was already old enough to think I'd seen everything the frontier had to show a man. I hadn't. I'd see plenty more on account of those two. The Ashby station sat where the drover's road came down out of the Ironwood Hills and crossed the flat toward the river, and old Mason Ashby had built it up from a sod dugout and a brush corral into a proper relay, a long low house, a barn that could winter 40 head, stage stock and saddle stock both, a smithy where I did the iron work, a well that never went dry even the year everything else did. The stage line changed teams there twice a week. Freight outfits laid over. Drovers pushing herds north watered and bought feed and slept in our hay for 2 bits. And Mason Ashby fed every one of them at his table whether they had the 2 bits or not. Because that was the kind of man he was. And because his wife had died young birthing their only living child and he had decided, I think, that a full table kept the loneliness off. That child was Della. She grew up in that yard among the horses and the freighters and the trail dust, and she grew up able to do every job on the place. She could shoe a horse in a pinch. She could keep the books in a hand neater than the banks. She could swing a team of 4 through the gate at a dead run and stop them on a dime, and she could lay out a meal for 20 hungry men out of what looked like nothing. The drovers were a little in love with her, all of them, in the way rough men are with a girl who is kind to them and not afraid of them and will laugh at their stories and not put up with their foolishness. But she had eyes for exactly one person on God's earth, and that was the quiet boy who broke horses for her father. Jess Calder had come to us at 14, an orphan off a busted-up freight outfit, half-starved and watchful as a wolf, and Mason had taken him in the way he took everybody in. The boy didn't have much to say, but he had a gift with horses that I have not seen the equal of before or since. He didn't break them, not the way most men meant the word. He'd get into the corral with some outlaw of a Mustang that had thrown every rider in the territory, and he'd just be there day after day, patient as weather, until the horse decided on its own that this strange still person was not a thing to be feared, and then the 2 of them would have an understanding that no whip could ever buy. Mason said the boy had the longest patience he'd ever seen in a human creature. "He waits things out," Mason told me once. "Most men can't. Jess can. He'll wait a thing out till it comes to him." I remembered that later, you'll see why. By the time Jess was 19 and Della 18, anybody with eyes could see how it sat between them. They didn't carry on. There was nothing in it that would have shamed a preacher. It was just that when she came across the yard he'd straighten up from whatever he was at, And when he came in to supper, she'd already have set his place, and the two of them would get to talking about nothing in particular. A foal coming, a wheel that needed setting, the weather up on the hills, and an hour would go by like 10 minutes, and old Mason would catch my eye across the room and not quite smile. He'd decided on it, Mason had. He told me so. He was going to take Jess on as a partner, give him a piece of the station, and let nature do the rest. The boy had no people and no name to speak of, but Mason didn't care about a name. He cared what a man would do with the work in front of him, and Jess would do anything. He's a better man than half the ones who'll look down on him for not having a daddy with money, Mason said. And he'll be good to her. He's the waiting kind. Those are the ones that last. It was set to happen in the fall after the drives. And then, 3 weeks before, the trouble came, and it came the way trouble mostly does, fast and ugly and out of a clear sky. There was a man in our country named Harlan Voss. He ran the freight line that competed with the stage, and he had ambitions bigger than freight. He was the kind of man who shook your hand warm and counted your fingers after to be sure he hadn't lost one. He'd been after Mason for 2 years to sell him the station. The location was worth a fortune to a man who wanted to control the road, and Mason had told him no every time, polite the first few times and then not polite at all. Voss did not take it kindly. Men like Voss never believe a thing can't be had. They only believe they haven't yet found the price or the lever. That autumn the eastbound stage was robbed coming down out of the Ironwood Hills, on the bad stretch of road above our station where the timber comes down close on both sides. 2 masked men, the driver said. They took the express box, and there was a passenger, a cattle buyer carrying money, and the buyer was a fool and went for a gun he had no business carrying, and one of the robbers shot him, and he died there in the road in the pine shadow. It was the first killing on that road in years. The whole county went up like dry grass. And within 3 days the law had a name, and the name was Jess Calder. I'll tell you plain how it was done, because I came to know it all in time, though it took 12 years to come out whole. There was a knife found near where the buyer died, a horn-handled skinning knife that everyone at the station knew was Jess's, because he'd carried it since he was a boy and there wasn't another like it. There was a witness, a drifter nobody'd seen before or since, who swore he'd seen Jess on the hill road that evening on his roan horse. And there was Jess's own foolish bad luck. He had no good account of where he'd been, because where he'd been was up in the high meadow alone, gentling a green colt by moonlight the way he liked to, with not one living soul to say so. The knife had been stolen out of the tack room a week before. Jess had told me himself he'd been hunting for it and figured he'd misplaced it. The witness was a paid liar. I'd stake my soul on it now, and I half believed it then. And the man who profited, the man whose freight wagons would have the road to themselves if the Ashby station fell into ruin and scandal, the man who within the year would offer Mason a humiliating low price for a place gone sour with a killer's name attached to it, that man was Harlan Voss. But none of that was proof. Proof is a hard thing. A knife and a witness and a boy with no name and no alibi, that was proof enough for the county that autumn. They were building a gallows in their minds before the inquest was even done. Mason fought it. He spent money he didn't have on a lawyer from the territorial capital. He stood up in the inquest and roared that the boy had been on his place all evening, though he knew, and I knew that wasn't strictly so, that Jess had been up the hill alone, and the lie did more harm than good because they tripped him on it. The mood in the country turned worse and worse. Twice men rode out toward the station after dark with rope on their minds. And twice Mason and I sat up on the porch with rifles across our knees and the lamp lit, and they came as far as the gate and saw us and thought better of it. But it was coming. Everyone knew it was coming. A frightened county wants a hanging the way a fever wants to break, and they had a name and a knife, and they were going to have their hanging. It was Della who made him run. I was there. I'll never forget it. The 3 of them, Mason, Della, Jess, in the kitchen by that very lamp late, the night before the marshal was due out to take Jess in for trial in town, where the trial would be a formality and the rope the only real verdict. Jess wanted to stay. He had it in his head that an innocent man running was as good as a confession, that if he just stood up and told the truth they'd have to believe him. He was 19 and he believed the truth was a thing that won by being true. Mason knew better and couldn't say so, and Della stood up from the table and she put both her hands flat on it and she looked at that boy she loved more than her own life and she said, "Jess Calder, if you stay you will hang. Not because you did it. Because they have decided to be done with this and you are the easiest way to be done. And I will not stand in a crowd and watch you die for nothing. So you are going to take the roan and the money in the strong box and you are going to go, tonight, north and far, and you are going to live." Della, "You are going to live," she said, and her voice cracked clean across the middle of it. "And someday this is going to come undone because lies come undone. My father says they always come undone, and when it does you are going to come back up this road. And I am going to be here. I don't care if it's a year or it's 20. I will keep this place and I will keep a light in that window and you will see it from the flat and you will know it's me, and you will know I never once believed it, not for a breath. Do you hear me? Now go." He went. God help him. He went. Because she made him, because she was stronger than he was that night. And the last thing I saw of Jess Calder for 12 years was the back of him riding north into the dark off the end of our flat. And the last thing he saw, if he turned, would have been a lamp burning in a kitchen window, and a girl standing in the door of it who had just sent away the only thing she ever wanted in order to save it. The next morning the marshal came and found his man gone, and the county had its proof now, didn't it? An innocent man doesn't run. They were almost glad. A guilty man fled is a tidier story than a hanging that troubles your sleep. And Harlan Voss, I have no doubt, slept like a babe. The years after were the slow kind of hard, the kind that doesn't kill you in a night but wears at you like water on stone. Mason Ashby was never the same. The fight over Jess had cracked something in him, and the country's coldness afterward, for they were cold to us now, the family that had harbored a killer, finished the cracking. He sold off the saddle stock to pay the lawyer's bill. The stage line, nervous of the station's reputation, talked of moving the relay down to a new place by the river that Voss had conveniently made available. Mason held on by his fingernails. And 4 years after Jess left, he caught a chill driving the eastbound team through an early storm because he couldn't afford to hire it done. And the chill went to his lungs, and he died in the back bedroom with Della holding one of his hands and me holding the other. And the last thing he said, clear as a bell after a day of raving, was, "He'll come back. He's the waiting kind. Tell her he'll come back." Then he was gone, and there were just the two of us, the old hostler and the girl, to keep a station that the whole country had decided to forget. Most people figured Della would sell then and go. A young woman alone, a place gone down at the heel, a name everyone whispered about. Voss certainly figured it. He came around within the month, all sympathy, his hat in his hands, and offered to take the burden off her shoulders for a price that was an insult dressed in kindness. I was in the smithy and heard the whole thing through the open door. "You're a young woman, Miss Ashby," he said, oily as a lamp. "This is no kind of life for you out here. Let me give you a fair price and you can go back east, start fresh, put all this unpleasantness behind you." And Della Ashby, 22 years old and just orphaned and alone in the world, looked that man in the eye and said, "Mr. Voss, I am going to keep this station if I have to nail every shingle on it myself, and I am going to keep it lit, and I am going to be standing right here when the truth comes home. And I have always thought, and I think it more every time you come up my road wearing that face, that you know better than any man alive what that truth is. Good day." He went white, then red, and he left, and he never made her a decent offer again, only mean ones, and she turned down everyone. I knew then she'd guessed it. She didn't have proof any more than her father had. But she knew, the way you know weather coming. So she kept it. Lord, how she kept it. She let me go more than once. "I can't pay you, Tobe. You ought to go where there's wages." And I told her every time that I was too old to learn a new place and she'd best save her breath. And I stayed. And between the two of us, we held that station together with grit and baling wire and pure stubbornness. She drove the stage team herself when the line was short a man, in a divided skirt that scandalized the town matrons, and the line kept her on because nobody could handle 4 through that hill road like she could. She cooked for the through traffic and built up a name for the best table on the road, so that drovers would push an extra 5 miles to lay over at Ashby's. She kept the books to the penny. She paid the taxes that Voss several times tried to get raised against her. And she got, year by year, that quiet steel her father'd had, the kind that doesn't shout, only endures and outlasts. And every single evening, the first thing she did when the light went out of the sky, before supper, before anything, she trimmed a wick and lit a lamp and set it square in the kitchen window facing north up the flat where the drover's road came down. I asked her once, early on, gentle as I could, whether she didn't think, after so long, that maybe. "He'll see it from the flat," is all she said, the same words she'd said the night he left, "and he'll know it's me." And she set the lamp in the window, and she never let me finish the question, and after a while I stopped asking it, and after a longer while I started lighting the lamp myself on the evenings her hands were full, because somewhere in there it had stopped being only her weight and become mine too. The whole country thought she was a sad, stubborn old maid throwing her best years away on a hanged man's ghost. They pitied her where they didn't sneer, and she let them think it and never bent an inch, and the lamp burned, and the years went by, 5, 8, 10, 12, and I will be honest with you and tell you that by the 12th year even I, who had promised a dying man, had mostly stopped believing the road would ever bring anything back up it but freight and dust. Which is how I came to be standing in the yard with a busted singletree at my feet on the night I told you about, looking up at a weathered stranger on a tired horse in a square of lamplight, my old heart going like a colt's against my ribs, while the man said Tobe, and I said Jess, and somewhere behind me in the house I heard a chair scrape back from a table. He'd changed, and that's no surprise. 12 years will change anybody, and 12 years lived hard will change them harder. The long-legged boy was a broad, spare, sun-cured man now, with gray already coming at his temples though he wasn't but 31, and a way of holding still and watching that he'd had as a boy but that had gone all the way to the bone in him now. There was a scar through one eyebrow. His hands, when he got down off the horse, were a working man's hands, cracked and scarred and strong. He'd left a hunted boy. He'd come back a man who looked like he'd worked his way across half a continent, which, I learned, he had. But the thing I want you to understand, the thing that mattered most that night and after, is that I looked into his face there in the lamplight, into those still gray eyes, and the boy was still in there. The one who waited things out. The one Mason said was the lasting kind. The years and the road and the hard living had weathered the outside of him to leather, but they hadn't gotten down into the part of him that counted. I'd half expected, if he ever did come back, that he'd come back ruined, soured. The way the country always swore the outlaw Calder must have gone a hard case, a man gone wrong, the proof of their old story. And here instead was a tired, honest man who'd ridden a long way home, and whatever the country had decided he'd become, he had quietly, stubbornly, across 12 years refused to become it. He'd waited himself out, you might say. He'd kept faith with who he was, same as she'd kept the lamp. He didn't go to the house. That struck me. He stood there by his horse with his hat in his hand, and he looked at the lit window, and he didn't go up to it, and I understood why. He didn't know. 12 years. He didn't know if she'd married, moved, died, given up. He didn't know if the lamp meant her or just meant a station that happened to keep a light. He'd ridden all this way on a thing he couldn't be sure of, and now that he was here he didn't have the nerve to find out. This man who'd faced down outlaw horses and a hanging county. He just stood there looking at the window like a man looking at a thing he wants too much to reach for. So I reached for it for him. "She's in there," I said, quiet. "She never left, she never married, she kept the place. She kept," and my old voice did a thing it hadn't done in years, and I had to stop and clear it. "She kept the lamp lit, son, every night, 12 years, that one in the window, she lights it for you." I watched that land on him. I watched 12 years of not knowing, of riding north and working and saving and gathering and not knowing. I watched it come up against the fact of that lamp, and I saw the man's face break the way the spring ice breaks on the river, all at once and with a sound you feel more than hear. And he turned his face away from me toward the dark so I wouldn't see, which was a kindness to us both. And while he had his back turned, the kitchen door opened, and Della came out onto the porch. She'd heard the horse, of course. She'd come to the door the way she came to the door for every horse that came up that road after dark, careful, a hand on the frame, the lamplight behind her. She was 30 now, and the prettiness of the girl had gone to something better, a kind of settled handsomeness with the steel showing in it. She had flour on her apron. She looked out into the yard at me, at the strange, tired horse, at the broad-shouldered stranger standing with his back half-turned and his hat in his hand, and I watched her not know him for one breath, too. And then she knew him. I won't try to tell you everything that was in her face, because some things a man hasn't got the words for and oughtn't to try. I'll tell you she didn't cry out. I'll tell you she didn't run to him, not at first. I'll tell you that Della Ashby, who had stood like a rock against a whole county for 12 years, put one hand flat against the door frame as if the ground had tilted, and she said, in a voice I had to strain to hear, "You came up the road." He turned around. "I told you I would," he said. "I'm sorry it took so long." And then she crossed that porch and that yard, and he dropped his hat in the dust and met her. And I will leave the two of them there in the lamplight and take myself off to see to that tired horse, because there are moments a man has no business standing and watching, even an old man who's earned a little of the watching, and that was one. I led the roan, for it was a roan again. He always rode roans, into the barn and rubbed it down and grained it and took my time about it, a long time. And when I finally came back across the yard, the porch was empty and there was light and low voices in the kitchen. And I stood out there in the cool dark a minute by myself, and I looked up at that window, and I said to a man 4 years in his grave, "He came back, Mason. He's the waiting kind. You were right." And then I went in to supper, because some things you say to the dead are enough said once. I expected that first night that the story would mostly be over. The boy was home. The girl had waited. Lord knew they'd earned a soft landing. But of course it wasn't over, because the lie that had driven him out was still standing, and a man can come home in the dark, but he can't live in the dark forever, and the morning was going to come with a county in it that still had Jess Calder down in its mind as a killer who cheated the rope. He knew it. That was the thing about Jess. He didn't have any illusions about what he was riding back into. He sat at that kitchen table that first night, with Della across from him, not able to take her eyes off him for fear he'd vanish if she blinked, and me at the end of it, and he laid it out plain. He'd gone north that night, the way she'd told him to. He'd ridden until the country was strange to him and then ridden farther, and he'd taken a new name in a mining camp where nobody asked after the old one, and he'd worked. He'd worked 12 years. He'd broken horses, he'd hauled freight, he'd worked a stamp mill, he'd ridden for a big outfit up in the grass country and worked his way up to be a man they trusted. He'd saved every dollar he didn't have to eat. Because the whole time, and here he looked at Della and then down at the table, because it was hard for him to say, the whole time he'd had it in his head that he was going to come back. Not to skulk back. Not to live hidden in some far place forever with her name, a thing he could never say. He'd come back to undo it. He'd needed 2 things to do that, and 12 years was how long it had taken him to get them. The first was money, not for himself to fight. He'd learned the hard way, watching Mason go broke, trying, that the truth doesn't win for free. It wins for lawyers and rewards and the kind of patient, paid, dogged work it takes to pull a buried thing back up into the light. He had it now. A real stake, earned honest, every cent. And the second thing, and this is where the room went very still, the second thing was a man. Up in the grass country, 2 years back, Jess had been working a roundup when a played-out old drifter signed on with the outfit. A sick man, coughing his lungs out, working for cards and a place by the fire because he hadn't long and knew it. And one night by that fire, not knowing who Jess was, for Jess was using his other name, the dying man had got to talking the way dying men do, unburdening, and he'd told a story. A story about a younger self, 12 years gone and 1,000 miles south, when a freight man had paid him good money to ride into a strange county and swear before an inquest that he'd seen a certain young horsebreaker on a certain hill road on the evening of a robbery. He'd never seen the boy in his life. He'd been paid to say it. The freight man's name, the dying drifter said, was Voss. He didn't know me, Jess said very low. He was just an old sick man telling his sins to the fire, and I sat there and he stopped. His hands were flat on the table and they weren't quite steady. I wanted to kill him. God forgive me, I sat there and I wanted to put my hands around his throat. 12 years he'd cost me. 12 years he cost, and he didn't look at Della, but his voice did, everybody. And I didn't. Because a dead drifter's a dead drifter, but a live one who'll put his hand on a Bible and swear what he just swore to the fire, that's the thing that brings it all home. So I didn't touch him. I waited. He'd waited. Of course he had. He'd taken that sick old man and he'd nursed him, got him to a town, got him a bed, paid a doctor, kept him alive and kept him willing, got a lawyer to take down his sworn statement before witnesses. All legal, all tight. The whole confession set down and signed and sealed. That Harlan Voss had paid him to perjure a man's life away. And then, with that paper locked up safe with the lawyer up north and copies made, Jess Calder had finally, after 12 years, turned his roan's head south and come home. So I'm not asking you to hide me, he said to Della, to me, to the lamp in the window. I didn't come back to hide. I came back to stand up in that same town that ran me out in front of that same county and put the truth on the table where they have to look at it. And then, he stopped, and for the first time that night something like the boy's old shyness came over the hard man's face. And then if she'll still have me, I came back for that too. But the truth first. I won't ask her to marry an outlaw. I'll ask her to marry an honest man in the open with his name clean, or I won't ask her at all. And Della Ashby, who had waited 12 years, looked across that table at him and said something I have carried with me ever since, something that tells you everything about the kind of woman she was and why a man would ride across a continent for her. She said, Jess Calder, you have it backwards and you always did, and I love you for it, but you're a fool. I'm not going to marry you because they clear your name. I never needed them to clear it. I knew the truth 12 years ago, and I have known it every single night I lit that lamp. And I would marry you tomorrow in front of the whole sneering county with your name as black as they ever painted it, because their idea of you is not you and never was, and I will not have you thinking my hand depends 1 inch on their good opinion. She leaned across the table. We will clear your name because it is owed to you, and because it is owed to my father who died defending it, and because that man Voss has walked free for 12 years on a thing he did to us, and I have been waiting a long time to see him answer for it. But you do not have to be clean for me to choose you. I chose you a long time ago. I am only telling you again because you seem to have forgotten while you were gone. The man put his face in his scarred hands, and the strong shoulders shook just once, and I got up quiet and took the coffee pot off the stove and busied myself at the far end of the room because, like I said, there are moments. I wish I could tell you that clearing it was easy after that the truth being true was enough. But you know better by now, and so did they. Harlan Voss had spent those same 12 years too, and he hadn't spent them breaking horses. He'd grown. The freight line was the smallest part of him now. He owned the bank in town, or near enough. He owned the new river bottom land the stage line had moved half its business to. He owned, in the way such men come to own things, a good piece of the law and a good piece of the talk in that county. He was a pillar now, a respectable man, a man who gave to the church and stood for the territorial assembly. And the dead cattle buyer's killing was an old, settled, comfortable story with a villain everybody'd agreed on long ago. Pulling that comfortable story apart and putting a respectable pillar in the villain's place, that was going to take more than one dying drifter's paper, no matter how legal. So they were careful and they were patient, the two of them, and they let me help, which I will be proud of to the end of my days. Jess didn't go riding into town to announce himself. That'd have been the boy's way, and he'd buried the boy's way a long time back. Instead, they went quiet to the territorial capital first, to the same kind of lawyer Mason had ruined himself on, only this time with money behind it and a signed confession in hand. They found a young U.S. land office man and a circuit judge new to the country who owed Voss nothing and didn't like what they saw when they started turning over rocks. Because once you knew to look, there was plenty under the rocks. Voss had been buying up the whole road, piece by ruined piece, for 12 years, and a smart man following the money could see the shape of a thing that had started with a robbery and a frame, and a station he wanted broke. It took the better part of a year. I'll spare you the lawyering, which bored me even living through it. What I won't spare you is the day it broke, because I was there, and there are not many days in an old man's life that he gets to watch a wrong of 12 years standing fall over in public, and I have hugged that day to me through every cold winter since. They held it in the town, in the same low courtroom where Jess would have been tried and hanged a dozen years before, and the whole county came, because word had got around that the outlaw Calder had come back and there was going to be some kind of reckoning, and a county loves a reckoning near as much as a hanging. They came expecting, I think, to see Jess Calder finally get his rope. They filled the room and the doorway and the street outside. And instead they watched a sworn, witnessed confession read out, the dying drifter's own words he'd passed on by then, but he'd left the paper, tight and legal, telling how Harlan Voss had paid him to swear a lie. They watched a lawyer lay out the stolen knife, and how easy it had been taken from an open tack room by a man who wanted it found. They watched the money traced, Voss's 12-year hunt up and down that road, the pattern of it laid bare. They watched the circuit judge, who owed Voss nothing, listen with a face like a closing door. And they watched Harlan Voss, the pillar, the banker, the candidate, sit there going from red to gray as the comfortable old story came apart around him plank by plank, and they watched him understand, the same as that frightened county had once understood about a nameless boy, that a thing had been decided, and he was going to be the one it was decided on. It came down on him within the hour. I won't dress it up with gun smoke for you. There wasn't any. That's not how those things truly end, mostly. It ended in paper and a judge's word, and a writ and Harlan Voss being taken out of that room by the same kind of law he'd bent for 12 years, his collar wilted, and his face the face of a man watching his own house burn. They held him for the killing, for it came out in the unraveling that the second masked man on the hill road that long ago evening had been Voss's own creature, and the cattle buyer's death lay where it had always truly lain, a long way from Jess Calder. He answered for it. The law took its slow time, but it took him in the end, and the River Bottom holdings and the bank and the respectable name all came down together, the way a thing built on a buried lie comes down once you dig the lie out from under it. But here is what I remember most, and it isn't Voss's gray face, though I won't pretend I didn't savor it. What I remember is the moment the judge spoke the words that set it right, that named Jess Calder an innocent man, wronged, cleared, his name his own again. And the whole packed room turned, all those faces that had wanted his rope, all that 12-year weight of whispers and pity and scorn, turned to look at the man it had been so wrong about for so long. And Jess Calder didn't look at them. He didn't gloat, and he didn't glare, and he didn't say a word to the county that had tried to hang him. He turned in his seat, away from all of them, and he looked back through the crowd to where Della Ashby sat in her good dress with her chin up, and the two of them just looked at each other across that room full of people, the way they used to look at each other across a station yard with an hour going by like 10 minutes, and that was the whole of his triumph, right there, and it was enough for him. He'd never cared what the county thought, not really. He'd cared about the truth being owed, and about her father's good name, and about being able to ask her clean. The county was just the work. She was the reason. They were married that autumn, 12 years late at the station, under the big cottonwood by the well, and near everybody in the country came, including a good many who'd whispered about her and sneered about him, because people are like that, they'd as soon be on the warm side of a thing once it's safe to be. Della let them come and fed every one of them at her father's long table, the best table on the road, because that was the kind of woman she was and the kind of man her father had been. And I think she did it partly to show them, in the kindest and most withering way there is, exactly the difference between her people and the Vosses of the world. Let them eat at the table they'd scorned. Let them taste what they'd been too small to see the worth of for 12 years. I gave her away. There wasn't anybody else, and she asked me, and I am not ashamed to say I wept like a child doing it, an old hostler in his one good coat handing the girl he'd half-raised across to the man they'd both waited a dozen years for. Mason should have had the doing of it, but Mason had told me, dying, that the boy would come back, and I figure standing up in his place that day was the last of the promise I'd made him, kept. And then they did the thing that, in the end, is the truest part of this whole long story, and the part I want to leave you with, because it's the part that lasted. They didn't sell. They didn't move to easier country, though they could have, with Jess's steak and Della's name on the best table on the road. They stayed, and they took that worn-down old station that two people had held together against the whole world with grit and baling wire, and they built it back up into the finest relay and ranch in the territory. Jess broke horses again, and his name as a horseman spread until men brought him outlaws to Gentle from 300 miles off, and the corral where the boy had once waded a Mustang into trust was busy from dawn to dark. Della ran the house and the books and the road business with that quiet steel, and the through traffic doubled and then doubled again. They put up new barns. They dug a second well. The stage line that had once tried to creep away to Voss's river bottom crept right back, hat in hand, because there was nothing on the whole road to touch Ashby's, and Della made them pay full freight for the privilege and never once let them forget which way the begging had finally run. And the children came, 3 of them, a girl and then 2 boys, and they grew up in that yard among the horses and the freighters and the trail dust, exactly the way their mother had, learning every job on the place, loved by the rough men who laid over, fed at the long table whether they had the 2 bits or not. The girl had Della's chin and Jess's stillness and her grandfather's gift with a horse, and the first time I saw that child of 6 weight a frightened pony into coming to her hand across a corral, patient as weather, I had to go around behind the barn a minute, an old man, and get hold of myself. I'm telling you all this from the porch of that station, where I still sit, too old now for any work but the watching which I've earned. Jess and Della are gray themselves now, and not so spry, but you should see them of an evening when the day's traffic is gone and the supper's done, the 2 of them out by the corral fence in the last light, his arm along her shoulders, not saying much, the way they never needed to, an hour going by like 10 minutes. 12 years they were apart. 30 near they've been together. The county's long forgotten it ever thought a single bad thing about either one of them. The children don't half believe the old story when the drovers tell it. And Harlan Voss is a name nobody says, gone down into the dust where buried lies go once you dig them up into the light. There's one thing they kept, though, out of all of it. You'd think they'd have been glad to put it away. But every single evening of every year since, the first thing that gets done at the Ashby station when the light goes out of the sky, before supper, before anything, is that somebody trims a wick and lights a lamp and sets it square in the kitchen window facing north up the flat, where the drover's road comes down out of the Ironwood Hills. The children do it now mostly, taking turns, the way you do a chore that's somehow more than a chore without anybody ever quite explaining why. They know it's for their daddy coming home, from back before they were born. They don't know, they're too young yet to know, everything that lamp once meant. A girl's whole stubborn faith against a whole county's certainty, a promise kept in the dark for 12 years, a light a hunted man saw from the flat and knew, all the way across that long cold distance, that he was loved and believed and waited for, and that the truth, like Mason Ashby always said, comes home in the end. It comes home up the road in the dark, tired and weathered and a long time getting there. And there's a light in the window for it when it does. There always was. I lit it myself, plenty of those years. And of all the things these old eyes have watched come up that road in a long life, the freight and the stages and the drovers and the dust. That's the one I'd wait the whole 12 years again to see. A man coming home to a lamp that never once stopped burning for him, set there by the steady hand of a woman who knew the truth of him when nobody else on God's earth would, and never, ever let it go out. That's the whole of it. That's how Jess Calder came home. I was there. I lit the lamp.